It was supposed to be a quiet evening. I had just settled into my favorite chair, the soft glow of the reading lamp casting a warm circle of light over my book. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the windows, the steady rhythm lulling me into a sense of comfort. Everything about the moment felt ordinary, normal. But then came the knock. It wasn't tentative, nor was it urgent. It was just firm enough to be disconcerting. 3 steady raps on the door, each one reverberating through the house and shattering the tranquility like a glass dropped on tile. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 10. Too late for a neighborly visit, too early for some drunken mistake. My first thought was that it might be a delivery, something left behind or forgotten, but the knock didn't feel like that. It had weight, purpose. My stomach tightened as I set my book down, listening for any sign of movement outside. Nothing but the rain. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. I didn't want to open it. I considered ignoring it, letting whoever it was go away. But the knocking came again, just as deliberate as before. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving without an answer. I turned the lock and pulled the door open slowly. At first, all I could see was the rain. Sheets of it poured down from the gutter above, obscuring the streetlights and painting the world in a hazy, shimmering gray. Then he stepped into view, a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with wet hair plastered to his head and an expression that wasn't quite desperate, but close. His coat was soaked through, water dripping off the hem and pooling on the doorstep. He looked like he'd been standing there for a while. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady but wary. He nodded, his face tightening as if he were preparing to deliver bad news. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his tone calm but controlled. "I'm looking for my wife." I blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't the kind of question you expect from a stranger on your doorstep. "Your wife?" I repeated, trying to make sense of it. "I don't think. She was supposed to be here," he cut in, his voice low and firm. "Or at least nearby. This is the address I was given." The address he was given? That didn't make any sense. I'd lived here for years and had no memory of seeing this man, or anyone who might be connected to him, before. My mind started racing, trying to piece together how he could have ended up here, why he thought his wife might be in my house. My gut told me to be careful, to keep my guard up. But something in his eyes stopped me from slamming the door and locking it behind me. It wasn't malice I saw there. It was something more complicated. Something like grief. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "But I don't know who you're looking for. Are you sure this is the right house?" "I'm sure," he said, his words clipped. "I didn't come here by accident." I stared at him, the rain continuing to pour down behind him, his presence on my doorstep surreal and unnerving. There was no one else in my house, no woman hiding upstairs, no stranger waiting in the shadows. And yet, the conviction in his voice made my chest tighten. He was so certain, so determined. For a brief moment, I wondered if I'd missed something, if there was some truth I didn't know yet. "I think you've made a mistake," I said, keeping my voice calm. "No one here matches that description. Maybe the address you have is off by a few numbers." He looked at me for a long time, his dark eyes unblinking. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No," he said. "This is the address she gave me." Something shifted in his tone. There was a heaviness to his words, as if he were speaking them against his will. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to believe he'd have to show up at a stranger's house looking for answers. But here he was, soaked to the bone, standing on my porch, insisting that his wife was supposed to be here. I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off. "Please," he said. "Just let me in for a minute. I just want to check. If I'm wrong, I'll leave." I hesitated, my heart pounding. My instincts screamed not to let him in. There was no one here. Letting him inside would only complicate things. But his face, his expression was one I couldn't shake. It wasn't the face of a man looking to cause trouble. It was the face of a man who had already lost so much and couldn't bear to lose any more. I stepped back, leaving the door open. "You can come in for a minute," I said. "But I'm telling you, there's no one else here." He walked in slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. He didn't look around wildly or rush into the house. Instead, he stood just inside the doorway, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the rain had finally gotten to him. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. I watched him as he scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the stairs, the hallway, the living room beyond. He didn't move from where he stood. He just looked, his expression shifting from tense to something more complicated. Something almost like resignation. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause. I had to be sure. The tension in my chest didn't ease. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Who told you she'd be here?" He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "I followed her here once," he admitted. "She didn't know I was watching. But I saw her come to this house." My stomach twisted. The idea of someone being watched, of someone coming here without my knowledge, made my skin crawl. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice rising. "I don't know your wife. I don't know you. No one else lives here." He shook his head slowly. "I saw her," he said again, his tone unwavering. "I saw her come here." I took a step back, suddenly feeling the weight of the situation in a way I hadn't before. The certainty in his voice wasn't just unnerving, it was chilling. He wasn't going to leave until he was sure, and I wasn't sure how to convince him of something that wasn't true. The moment he said he'd followed her here, my entire world felt unsteady. I glanced at the door I'd left ajar, as if to reassure myself that there was still an escape route. But it wasn't me who needed to escape, he was the one looking for someone who wasn't here, who couldn't possibly be here. And yet his certainty, his absolute conviction, made me question the boundaries of what I thought I knew about my own life. "She's not here," I said again, my voice quieter this time, tinged with something close to desperation. "You've made a mistake. I live alone. No one comes here but me." His eyes scanned the room once more. I could see the gears turning behind his gaze. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't angry. Instead, he looked almost lost. Like a man searching for a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "I know what I saw," he said quietly. "I saw her come to this house. She was wearing a blue scarf, carrying that black bag she always had. She knocked on that door, your door, and someone let her in." My breath caught in my throat. A blue scarf. A black bag. Those details were so specific, so vivid, that I couldn't dismiss them entirely. Still, I shook my head, my hands gripping the back of a chair for support. "I don't know your wife," I said, more firmly this time. "I've never seen anyone who matches that description. You're mistaken." He turned back to me, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Maybe she lied about why she was coming here," he admitted. "Maybe she said she was visiting someone else. But she was here. I'm sure of it." Something about his tone shifted then. It wasn't just about finding his wife anymore. There was a sadness in his voice, a resignation that made the air in the room feel heavy. "She's been acting differently for months," he said, as if I had asked. "At first, I thought it was just stress. But then she started disappearing for hours at a time. No explanation, no phone calls, no texts. Just gone. And when she came back, she wouldn't talk about where she'd been. She would just say, 'I went for a drive.'" I stayed silent, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell him to stop, to leave and take his confusion somewhere else. But another part of me, the part that felt the pull of his pain, wanted to listen. He wasn't just some unhinged stranger banging on my door. He was a man who had lost his grip on the life he thought he knew, and now he was clutching at whatever threads he could find. "You're certain this is the house?" I asked carefully. "There's no chance it was a different place?" He shook his head. "It was here. The same number on the mailbox. The same flowers in the front garden. I followed her, and I waited outside for over an hour. I saw the light in the front window. And then she left, looking nervous, like she didn't want to be seen." I frowned, my mind racing. None of this made sense. I didn't have flowers in my garden, just a few weeds I hadn't gotten around to pulling. And no one had been here. At least, not that I knew of. Was he confusing my house with another? Or had someone been here without my knowledge? "I don't know what to tell you," I said finally. "I've lived here for years, and I've never seen anyone matching that description. Maybe you have the wrong place, or maybe," I hesitated, unsure if I should say it. "Maybe someone's been coming here without my knowledge." His gaze sharpened. "You think someone's been in your house without you knowing?" I bit my lip, uneasy with the idea. "No," I said quickly. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to figure out how this could have happened. Maybe she came to the wrong house. Maybe she—" "No," he interrupted. "She wasn't confused. She was too careful for that. She knew exactly where she was going." His certainty shook me. I had no reason to believe him, but his conviction was unshakable. It wasn't the words of a man grasping at straws. It was the words of someone who truly believed he'd found the answer. I felt a chill run down my spine, a creeping sense of unease that made me glance around the room, as if expecting to find something out of place. "I don't know what you expect me to do," I said, my voice tight. "If your wife came here, I didn't see her. I don't know her, and I don't have any answers for you." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I believe you," he said softly. "But that means someone else has answers." His words lingered in the air, a weight that settled on my chest. I felt like I was being drawn into something much larger than a missing wife. Something I wasn't prepared for. The rain had stopped by the time he left. I stood by the window, watching him walk down the street, his figure shrinking into the distance. The unease he'd brought with him hadn't left. If anything, it had only grown worse. I should have been relieved to see him go, to have my house to myself again, but instead, I felt like something vital had been broken. His certainty lingered in my mind. He had no reason to lie to me, at least, none that I could see, and his pain had been so raw, so real. I wanted to put the whole incident behind me, but the questions wouldn't stop. Had someone else been in my house? Had I missed something? And most importantly, was there any chance he was telling the truth? I decided to start with the obvious. If someone had been coming here, there would be signs. I spent the next few hours walking through every room, looking for anything out of place. I checked the windows, the doors, the locks. Everything seemed normal. There were no scuff marks on the floor, no broken latches, no indication that anyone had been sneaking in. The only person who came and went was me. But as I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was overlooking something. I thought back to what he'd said, the flowers, the blue scarf, the black bag. They were such specific details. Too specific to be made up on the spot. The flowers were the part that stuck with me the most. I didn't keep flowers in the front garden. I never had. I wasn't the type to care about landscaping, and the few times I tried planting anything, it hadn't lasted long. I stepped outside, pulling my jacket tighter against the damp evening air. The ground was wet and muddy, and I could see the faint outlines of my own footprints from earlier. But there was something else. At the far edge of the yard, near the front fence, a small patch of soil had been disturbed. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed obvious. Someone had dug there recently. It wasn't a big hole, just a small, shallow disturbance, as if someone had tried to plant something and then quickly gave up. My heart raced as I knelt down and brushed away some of the mud. The more I cleared, the more it became clear that something had been buried there. I kept digging, my hands shaking, until I uncovered what looked like the remnants of a flower bulb. It had been planted recently, but whoever had done it hadn't watered it properly, and it had started to rot in the damp soil. I sat back on my heels, staring at the spot. Who had done this? And why? I didn't remember anyone coming near my house in weeks, let alone long enough to plant something. I tried to think of any reason why someone would leave a flower here, if it was some kind of message, if it had any connection to the man's missing wife. But none of it made sense. I went back inside, my mind racing. I knew I should call someone, maybe the police, maybe a neighbor, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That a stranger showed up at my house claiming his wife had been here, and now I'd found a flower bulb in the garden? It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the unease grew. I didn't have an explanation. And without one, the questions would only keep piling up. I locked all the doors and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the house. I thought about the man's face, the way his voice trembled when he spoke about his wife. I thought about the blue scarf, the black bag, the light in the window that he swore he'd seen. I thought about the disturbed patch of soil and what it could mean. And through it all, a single question kept repeating in my mind. Who had been here, and why? When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of shadows moving through the house, of whispered conversations I couldn't quite hear. I woke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The questions hadn't gone away. If anything, they felt more pressing than ever. The next morning, I made up my mind. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. I had to find out the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. I just didn't know where to start. I woke up that morning with the weight of uncertainty still pressing down on me. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The questions from the night before were louder than ever in my head. I couldn't just ignore them. Something had happened, something that didn't make sense, and I needed answers. I decided to start where I'd left off, with that disturbed patch of soil. Maybe there was more to find, something I'd missed in the fading light the night before. Pulling on a coat, I stepped into the brisk morning air. The grass was still damp with dew, and the faint smell of rain lingered in the air. When I reached the spot, I crouched down and examined it more closely. The soil was still turned over, but it didn't look as if anyone had been back since I'd dug it up. The flower bulb I'd found was shriveled and useless, just a rotten husk. But something else caught my eye, a faint outline in the dirt, almost like a small footprint, as though someone had stood here not too long ago. It wasn't much, but it was something. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, feeling a little foolish as I did it. What was I going to do with a photo of a partial footprint? But it felt better than doing nothing. At least it was evidence that someone other than me had been in my yard. I spent the rest of the morning going through the house again, trying to find anything else that might be out of place. I checked every room, every closet, every drawer. But everything seemed normal. No signs of forced entry, no missing items, no unfamiliar objects. It was as if whoever had been here had left no trace, except for that small patch of soil in the garden. It was frustrating, to say the least. I felt like I was chasing a ghost, piecing together fragments of a story that didn't add up. I kept going back to what the man had said. His wife had been here, he was certain of it. She'd come to this house, knocked on this door, and someone had let her in. But who? It wasn't me. It couldn't have been. I was the only one who lived here. At least, that's what I thought. As the day wore on, I started to wonder if there was more to this house than I realized. It had always been quiet, tucked away on a peaceful street. I'd never had any trouble here. But what if I was wrong? What if someone else had used this place, someone I didn't know about, someone who had their own reasons for being here? The thought made my skin crawl. I decided to do some digging, not in the garden, but in the history of the house. I pulled out my laptop and started searching online. I looked up property records, old news articles, anything that might give me a clue. At first, I found nothing unusual. The house had been owned by a few different people before me, none of whom seemed particularly noteworthy. No crimes, no scandals, no strange incidents. Just a normal house in a normal neighborhood. But then I found a mention of a previous owner who had passed away under somewhat mysterious circumstances. It wasn't anything dramatic, a heart attack, they said, but there was a brief note in an old neighborhood newsletter about how the man had lived alone and kept to himself. The article mentioned that he had an unusual collection of artifacts that was sold off after his death. No details about what those artifacts were, just a vague reference. It didn't seem connected to the current situation, but it was the only thing I could find that stood out. I also searched for missing persons reports, hoping to find any mention of a woman matching the description the stranger had given me: blue scarf, black bag. But nothing came up. No reports from the area, no one fitting that description. It was as if she didn't exist. Or if she did, no one had reported her missing. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling more lost than ever. I still had no explanation, no clear answers. But I did have one lead: the previous owner. If he had kept artifacts or objects that drew attention, maybe someone had been coming here to retrieve something he left behind. Maybe his collection wasn't completely sold off, and someone thought it was still here. It was a thin lead, but it was all I had. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. If someone believed there was something valuable in this house, they might come back. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's missing wife was connected to all of this, even if I didn't know how. And if she had come here once, maybe she'd come again. I wasn't sure if that thought comforted me or terrified me. By the time the sun started to set, I felt no closer to understanding what was going on. But one thing was clear: I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had happened in this house, something I wasn't aware of, and until I found out what it was, I wouldn't be able to rest. I had to keep looking, keep digging, until I uncovered the truth, even if it meant facing whatever had been left behind. That evening, the house felt heavier than it ever had before. Every creak, every groan of the old wooden floorboard seemed amplified. The air was thick with unanswered questions, and I found myself pacing the living room, my thoughts spiraling. The details the man had shared still echoed in my mind: the blue scarf, the black bag, her nervous demeanor. These weren't the kinds of things someone invents out of thin air. And then there was that small footprint in the soil, proof that someone had been in my yard. But who? And why? I knew I couldn't keep relying on hunches. I had to find something concrete. Earlier in the day, I'd uncovered that brief mention of the previous owner's unusual collection. It wasn't much, but it gave me a direction. Maybe there was still something in the house that had been overlooked, something hidden, something that might explain why a stranger would come looking here. I started with the basement. It was the most obvious place to keep anything of value or significance. The door creaked as I pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into shadows. I flipped the light switch, and a single bulb sputtered to life. The weak light barely illuminated the space below, but it was enough to see that the basement was mostly empty. The cement floor was cold under my feet, and the walls were lined with old, peeling paint. A few boxes were stacked in the corner, left over from when I first moved in. I had gone through them before, at least, I thought I had, but now I wondered if I'd missed something. I went through the boxes one by one. Most of them were filled with my own old belongings, books I never unpacked, kitchen items I never used, miscellaneous junk I didn't know what to do with. But then I found something I hadn't noticed before. In one box, tucked underneath a layer of dusty newspapers, was a small wooden box with a brass latch. It didn't look like mine. In fact, it didn't look like it belonged to me at all. I pulled it out, brushing off the dust, and set it on the floor. The wood was dark and worn, the brass latch tarnished with age. It had a simple, unassuming look, nothing fancy, nothing ornate. But it didn't feel ordinary. I hesitated for a moment before flipping the latch and opening the lid. Inside, I found a small collection of objects that made no immediate sense. There was a piece of fabric that looked like it had once been part of a scarf, though the color had faded so much it was hard to tell. There was a tiny leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and stiff with age. And there was an old, tarnished key on a thin piece of string. The key was small, almost delicate, and I couldn't imagine what it might have opened. I picked up the notebook, carefully thumbing through its pages. Most of them were blank, but a few had writing on them, small, cramped handwriting that was difficult to read. I squinted at the faded ink, making out only fragments of words, hidden, away from them, never let it be found. The words sent a chill down my spine. What had the previous owner been hiding? And why had he left these things behind? My hands trembled slightly as I set the notebook down and picked up the key. It was cool and heavy in my palm. I turned it over, looking for any markings, but there were none. It was just a plain key. Yet something about it felt significant, as if it were a piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving. I placed the items back in the box and closed the lid. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what I'd found. These weren't just random trinkets. They had meaning I didn't yet understand. The man's wife had come here for a reason. She had knocked on this door, entered this house. And now I had found a box that didn't belong to me, containing objects that hinted at something hidden, something protected. It couldn't be a coincidence. But as much as I wanted to understand, the answers didn't come. I carried the box back upstairs, setting it on the kitchen table. I sat down and stared at it, feeling as though I were on the edge of a revelation, but unable to make the final leap. I wanted to call someone, to show them what I'd found, to ask for help. But who would I call? The police? And what would I tell them? That a stranger had knocked on my door, claiming his wife had been here, and now I'd found a mysterious box? It sounded ridiculous. And yet, it was the only lead I had. I decided to sleep on it. Maybe, with time, the pieces would start to make sense. Maybe I'd remember something, some detail I'd overlooked. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the dark ceiling, I felt no closer to understanding. I felt only the same unease I'd had since the first knock on my door. The stranger had been looking for his wife, and he'd left without her. But her presence lingered. It lingered in the disturbed soil, in the faded fabric, in the cryptic words scrawled in that notebook. And it lingered in my thoughts, a question that refused to be answered. By the time I drifted off to sleep, I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't ignore this anymore. If I wanted to move on, if I wanted to reclaim my life, I had to find out what really happened in this house.